and I'm going to have her start with our, I think, so welcome to the BRJA panel for this month. We want to make sure you all have a few minutes to kind of get into the Zoom room and get settled. So we are about to actually get started now. If you want to have some pen and paper, in case you want to like do some journaling or you want to answer, write down some questions, because we will have a section where audience members are able to ask questions. So make sure you have that for you. Next up, just some virtual housekeeping. We are going to be having a conversation today, and your voice is encouraged, and we welcome it. And we want you to use the chat box, and of course, like I said, during the discussion period, the Q&A period, you are welcome to ask questions then. Until then, especially with the panel, making sure to mute yourself when you're speaking so we can minimize audio feedback so everyone can hear. And we, of course, encourage you to share and put your video on, but it's not required. So we want you to feel comfortable. Next up. We believe that this space that we're trying to cultivate here is a learning community. So we're really happy that you're here, and you are just more than the audience. And so we want you to make sure that we're all working towards racial justice and learning, and that's going to be important. So having that paper and pen, taking notes, asking questions is highly encouraged. Next. Last month, we had an event called The Racial History and Implications of Overturning Roe v. Wade. It was really awesome. Michelle, who is my partner in the BRJA Project of the Month kind of creation and did an excellent job. So if you were interested in looking at that event, you can use this QR code. It will go to our YouTube channel, and you can actually watch that. Obviously, watch it after you watch this awesome event. But that's what we have. And next up, you are joining us today for a discussion on environmental racism. And so I hope that you are here to learn more and, broaden our minds around this topic. Next. And then we have an event coming up on September 13th. It's going to be from 6 to 7:30. It's going to be underreported news. It's going to be part 2 of that. So I hope that you all are ready to have that discussion. It was a really good one the first time around. That first one should also be on our YouTube channel. So about BRJA. So we were officially founded in 2003, and we have our roots in the Agents of Change workshops that begin in 1996. And we are a program of Fusion Partnerships, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And what we do is we do a bunch of different things. And one of those things is we provide these open to public events for 13th of the month. And we also do short take videos. Those short take videos are usually on our Instagram, but you can find them on our YouTube page as well. And so we do those kind of like monthly. We're talking about either like broad events like the one we're doing here, or kind of smaller pop culture references and how they align with race, racism and oppression. Next slide. And we also, other than doing these events, we do our ARAO work with consulting, coaching, and assessment and workshops. You can learn more about that work and like possibly how you want to get involved, or if you want to use it as a resource on our website, which is bemoreantiracist.org. It is a really good website name, if I didn't say so myself. We are also on social media. You can look us up and please subscribe to our channel on Baltimore Social Justice Action, as well as on Facebook, where we share different events and offerings from our organization. And next slide. We are also on Twitter at BeMoreAntiRacist, and then of course on Instagram. So you can follow our feed for events. And because we are a small organization and we are, of course, out here trying to make sure that we are doing ARAO work that is important for our community, we want to sustain this work. And so if you would like to become a monthly sustainer, you can use this QR code, or you can visit us at bemoreantiracist.org/donate. And you can click the donate to PayPal to kind of, donate us money so we can continue doing events just like these. And you can also be a one-time donator. So making sure if you just want to donate to see more events because you like this event, please make sure to share. Okay, and so now we're going to get started on a discussion on environmental racism. My name is Julia Scott, and I am going to be our kind of panel host for today, our mistress of ceremony, if you will. And I'm really excited about this event because I care about the environment and I care about all of these things, but I am not I don't know everything. And so we have a really awesome panel, I think, to kind of have us dig a little bit deeper into these topics. And clearly, if you've been experiencing the weather and everything else, or living in the city, you are probably have some questions. So this is going to hopefully maybe start some of that. So next slide. Today's agenda, this is kind of the BRJA welcome, as we call it in our overview. And we're going to do a why are we here, kind of getting some event background. We're going to do some panel introductions. We're also going to do some definitions that we want you all to like read through some words you might hear from today. And then we're going to actually have like some panel discussion around some topics. And then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you all have any questions for what we discussed today, please make sure you're writing those questions down. You can write them down personally or put them in the chat. And then we're going to close out and let you enjoy the rest of this beautiful Saturday. So let's get into some event background. So as you all know, we do these events every 13th. Before COVID, we were in person, obviously. But we did an event on racism and climate change about 4 years ago. And so we know that environmentalism and climate justice conversations are only continuing to grow both globally and domestically. And we know that, these issues run the gamut. Of course, a lot of the time we hear these words, we think about the climate, so like the weather, we think about the forest, we think about water and air pollution. But that is not just what these things are about. And we also know that communities of color and those who are from different socioeconomic statuses, they're being impacted by these issues in a very different way. And so it's really important that as we're having these conversations, that they are at the table and they are not just there listening, they are being active. And that's actually happening, but we don't really see that in the discussion. So where are we now? And that's kind of like that's kind of a question I think that sparked us. Where are we now on these issues? What has changed? Has anything changed? And what can we do? And so we have our panel here that's going to help us kind of like talk about this. So I'm going to have these three wonderful folks introduce themselves, their names, and what they do. And I want to thank them for joining us. So you are up first. Go ahead, Senowa.
Yeah, it looks like it. Thank you, Julia, for all of that background and intro. And I'm really excited to be here. My name is Senowa Mize-Fox. I use she, her pronouns. I've lived in Baltimore, Maryland for about 5 years now. I'm originally from Rhode Island by way of Vermont. So I've lived in a lot of different places. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of background noise there. Thank you. And I have been doing climate justice, environmental justice, and racial justice organizing and work for about 8 or 9 years now. And I have a background in like climate science and natural resources planning. For 5 years, I worked for the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a national organization, alliance of about now 80 grassroots frontline organizations. Those are terms that we that are going to come up during this panel. And now I work for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and I am kind of a bridge between the climate environmental justice movement and funders who fund that movement. So that is just a really quick summary of me and what I do. And I'm incredibly passionate about this work and really excited to be here with co-panelists and all of you. Check.
Awesome. Naadiya.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naadiya Hutchinson. I live in Remington right now. I've lived in Baltimore for the past 7-ish years. I currently work for We Act for Environmental Justice. We're based in Northern Manhattan, but I work out of our DC office. And we are one of the only environmental justice organizations that has office out of DC. And we also convene the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, which is a coalition of 50 grassroots organizations throughout the United States. I also am on Baltimore City's Climate Action Plan. I'm one of the resident advisors working on trying to have equity in our upcoming Climate Action Plan. And I'm also an EJ griot with Black Millennials for Flint, focused on lead paint and lead hazards in public housing and in rental housing in Baltimore City. So that's a bit about me. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'll kick it over to Dante.
Great. Hey, folks. My name is Dante Swinton. I use he or they pronouns. I live in Baltimore as well, and have lived here most of the last 8 years. I spent most of the last 7 years working on zero waste efforts in the city to try to shut down the city's incinerator. I now work for the Center for International Environmental Law, which is based out of DC and Geneva. And yeah, looking forward to this conversation, and I'm sure it'll be a good one.
Awesome. Thank you all once again. They all do really amazing work, and you're going to see in a couple minutes because we had a really awesome conversation, and I learned a lot just in an hour. So we can go to the next slide. So there are a lot of, every, I think, organization or group or any kind of movement, they have language, right? And definitions are really important. And so we want to do a little bit of shared language, which is really important for you all to understand. So when we're saying these things, so two of the definitions, environmental justice and climate justice. So environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. Environmental justice recognizes that due to racism and class discrimination, communities of color and low-income neighborhoods are the most likely to be harmed by toxic chemicals and negative land uses, and the least likely to benefit from the efforts to improve the environment. And then we also have the definition for climate justice as a term, and more than that, a movement that acknowledges climate change can have differing social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations. Advocates for climate justice are striving to have these inequities addressed head-on through long-term mitigation and adaptive strategies. So these are two terms you will definitely hear today as we were talking about environmental justice. But there are some other terms. And so we're going to share these slides. I'm not going to read them out. We're going to give you a couple minutes to kind of read through. So if you hear them, you'll know what we are discussing. I'll give you a couple minutes. We can go to the next slide. Next slide. Next slide. The next one, the next slide is going to be a graphic of a just transition. I'm going to ask Noah to explain it to wrap it up for us.
Sure. Thanks, Julia. So you had the term just transition on one of the other slides, but this is a really good visual to kind of put forth like where we are and where we want to be if true like environmental and climate justice is to come to fruition. So essentially right now we live in an extractive economy. We like to call it the dig, burn, dump economy. Right? We are extracting natural resources from the ground. We are using them, and overall, we are not reusing them. So I think someone earlier mentioned that Wegmans is going green. We can talk about how overall, yes, I think that is a great thing to use less plastic in packaging, have less packaging overall, but it is like one small piece of kind of where we want to be, which is what we call a regenerative economy, or an economy where we will use natural resources, but also reuse natural resources and keep fossil fuels in the ground. And the middle part of this graphic is like kind of how we get there. So how do we stop the like overall extraction that is happening and build this new system and like divest from the economy, from this current economy that we live in, and invest in community-led solutions. So I'm happy to answer more questions about this graphic, which is, by the way, put together by the Climate Justice Alliance and Movement Generation, which are two really good national orgs.
Thank you so much. And it is, now that you've explained it, I see it a lot more clearly, because yesterday I was like, I'm going to have to explain this. And I was like, I don't know what this is. But no, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. If you all have any questions about that, please you can put that in the chat, and hopefully we can answer those questions as we talk more about this topic. So we're going to get into the panel, because this is why people are here, and this is kind of the meat of the conversation. So for our next slide, I want to, we put up some questions. We're hoping to get through most of these, but just in case some other things come up. So I want to hear from the panel, and you all can decide who wants to answer first. But we hear these terms, climate justice and environmental justice, and they can mean very different things to people who are not actually in the work. And so, what exactly is climate and environmental justice movements, and what are some of the issues that are actually within the movement? Where it's contained? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I can go first, and
Awesome.
This is a heavy question. I would say that in terms of like order of events, like the environmental justice movement kind of predated the climate justice movement, but that they're deeply interconnected. So the environmental justice movement, from my perspective, really focuses on legacy pollution and future developments. So we think more like clean air, clean water, trying to decrease the amounts of pollutants in our environment that disproportionately impacts people of color and low income folks. And then climate justice is kind of this present moment of climate change, as well as the future, recognizing that everyone will be impacted by climate change, but that people of color and low income folks will more likely experience the worst impacts of climate change. I'd also want to just add that both the climate justice and the environmental justice movement are really deeply rooted in intersectionality. So these issues also touch on reproductive justice issues. They also touch on civil rights issues, youth rights issues, human rights issues. So there's a lot of intersectionalities between both the climate justice and environmental justice movement and each other, but also with other movements. I'd say that in particular, a lot of the climate justice and environmental justice movement work is going through almost like an influx of organizing capacity due to a lot of money from the Black Lives Matter movement and like resurgence that we had in the past few years. A lot of environmental groups that were working on climate and working on environmentalism realized that they weren't actually having that intersectionality between justice, racial justice issues. And so that's kind of like what I think of when I think of these two movements. They're sometimes seen separately, but they're oftentimes seen by organizers as one and the same. And I'd also add that these climate justice and environmental justice movements are also uniquely different from like climate change organizers and environmental organizers in many ways. The history of environmental justice actually stems from exclusion from environmentalism. Environmental justice organizers came together in 1991 during the Peoples of Color Environmental Summit and created the founding principles of the environmental justice movement, kind of from a place that was like separate from and recognizing that they were being intentionally excluded from environmentalism.
Wow. Okay. So even in we're all sharing this space, and even then, still in these movements, a lot of exclusion and not really, looking at the systems themselves. Okay. Anybody else want to answer or?
Yeah. I think that, we obviously talk a lot about toxics and the disproportionate impact on people of color and low-income communities, but also I think there needs to be even more attention paid to general like proximity to healthy food, proximity to tree canopies, because we live in a city like Baltimore where there are a number of communities that have little to no tree coverage, and temperatures are just increasing. We're going to have by 2080 like a climate more like northern Mississippi in the city. So like the fact that folks may not have direct access to shade, to a grocery store and the like are other components of the environmental justice movement that we have to lift up more as well. And obviously with the climate justice component of increased heat, and a lot of homes in Baltimore do not have air conditioning, and increased heat makes you more irritable, which leads to more violence, and just it's a whole thing. So we have to address those aspects too, because it also includes access to transit and then just tie those all together. And so being able to talk about both of them in the same place is really helpful. And in terms of issues, I would say that there's definitely a perpetual struggle between the big green groups like your Sierra clubs and what have you versus these grassroots groups that may or may not have enough money to pay someone full time for a month. So not being able to see the funding come down to these grassroots and frontline and fence line communities has always been a problem. And even though there are some larger green groups that have registered that and have started making an effort to funnel more money down, there's still a lot of them that don't, and that needs to change as we move forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So thank you for getting into for someone who's outside of the work, how we're viewing it. It's like, oh, the Sierra Club and these kind of big organizations, and also kind of like, what I think that graphic is talking about. These people are going to stay, but they're going to come in, versus I think the kind of very real work that's happening on the ground with everyday people, and those people not getting enough of the money, the funds, or the support, or even the recognition. That's going to be very important. Did you want to say anything, Senowa? I want to make sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to also touch upon some terms that Dante was talking about. So we talk a lot in the climate and environmental justice movements about big greens. And so I want to define that, because I think I realized that term gets thrown around a lot. So a big difference between like environmentalism and environmental justice, as Naadiya said, is that environmental justice comes out of the exclusion of Black and brown folks from the environmental movement. There's a lot of really fascinating history about like how eugenics are tied to environmentalism, which we don't have time to get into on this panel, but I definitely could find some resources for folks to read into. But there are groups like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and even like 350 that are like, and some Sunrise is debatable, but there are large national organizations, right, that have chapters around the country that you have probably heard of, that probably come and recruit volunteers. And they have a lot of funding, right? They already have a lot of resources. They continue to get a lot of resources, while grassroots groups, who are groups that are on the ground and are directly affected by environmental racism and climate injustice, are not getting, you know, those same resources and are kind of being swept under the rug. And there's a big history also of like kind of the co-optation of terms that grassroots groups have been using for years, and to make these big greens seem like they are also doing the same on the ground work that grassroots groups have been doing for years. And I just want to like make that point, because I think it is like, we see it all the time. I think when you Google environmental justice, the history of environmental justice, the first search term that comes up on Google is from the Sierra Club. And this has been true for a long time. And you will see a lot of these terms, especially when they're trendy, right? Climate justice is trendy now.
Yeah.
A lot more funding is being given to these big greens to do the work, where as grassroots organizations and frontline communities have had these solutions for years and are not getting funded. So I just want to like make that that point, spinning off the other two.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, you all kind of already answered the question of the history of the environmental movement and how it differs, right? So that kind of like answers that question. And I think that it's really important that we also see this in like so many spaces. It's like, I think especially since like 2020 with everything that we've all experienced, but particularly like, you know, in the kind of ARAO work, anti-oppression work that we see, everyone now has the language. And so the kind of beautiful things that, okay, we're all speaking the same language, but it also allows that kind of coaptation of people to be like, okay, well, now I am doing ARAO work because I know what white supremacy actually means. And so they start using it, and it ends up losing all of its kind of actual meaning, and that history gets lost. So that these things are kind of like replicated in other movement work. I want people to recognize that. And so you all mentioned a bunch of different topics, right? Like we talked about, you know, food, you know, being an issue. We talked about, of course, like trees and clean air. What do you all think are some of the national and local environmental and climate issues that people should be focusing on, that you think are really important at this moment?
I guess I'll start. I feel like just this week has been a fascinating event with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was certainly something. It was a bill that they chose to pass, and I would say that like there are some good things in it, and like my organization CL has had a discussion this week of just like, you know, how do we both like, you know, call out the things that are bad in it, but also recognize that there are organizations that do see some of the good in it, even if it is often very terrible. Like I need to have a bill that provides funding for renewable energy, but then also has a clause that says you have to provide public land to oil and gas before you provide it to wind and solar. Like how truly ridiculous that is. So like one step forward and then like 8 steps back, and it's really, really irritating. But like, you know, being able to identify where some of these projects are across the country, and making sure that those communities voices are being heard before these projects get permitted, and hopefully there's still ways to continue pushing back on them before they actually get executed. There's just a lot of money into false solutions, which is among the definitions that we saw earlier. And we have to push back at those and actually advocate for the more just solutions that don't harm communities of color, low-income communities, as harshly as the policies that are in this bill would. So there's still places to interject, but you know, it does seem to put us in a bad position moving forward. So that's certainly something worth considering paying attention to. But there's also some money out there that the EPA is giving to communities to do some more actually just solution stuff. So we need to find a way to maximize our ability to acquire that funding and do the right things before the more terrible things come about.
So us focusing on looking at some of the wins, but really having a deeper introspection of what do these things actually mean? Because we hear about bills being passed or things, we're like, well, this is great, right? Like we're gonna be okay, and then not reading any deeper into like what it actually is saying. So there's 20% over here is like great, you're feeding into this and it's wonderful and it's helpful, but the rest of it is like, and we're still like a part of that kind of extracting kind of economy that we were talking about in that graph, right? So it's like that's still happening. Okay. Anyone else? Like, what are some other issues that we should be kind of focusing on or thinking about?
Sorry, the unmute. Who's gonna unmute first? Yeah, I think thanks Dante for bringing in the IRA bill, and I would love to send over some resources that from organizations that kind of break down just like why this is a really bad deal for frontline communities. There's like a provision essentially in the bill that makes it so in West Virginia, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which has been like stalled for years, and like activists in West Virginia who live near the pipeline have been fighting it for years, is now going to be completed because like they had to make a deal with Joe Manchin, who's the senator from West Virginia, partially in order to get this bill passed. So I can definitely send over like a breakdown of all, like, here are some like okay things that the bill does, and then here are like some really bad trade-offs. And my organization is also like in conversation, is like how do we discuss this bill, right? Because for a lot of folks, this is the biggest climate bill that has ever passed, right? And it is, and the fact that it is also an issue given all of the trade-offs that have happened. And these trade-offs are going to directly impact Black and Brown communities the most. And like I like want to get that point of anything else in this panel is like a lot of these big scalable projects are like going to impact Black and Brown communities by like trading off having power plants built in communities of color, but not necessarily white communities. There's also going to be like, if you are reading the news and hearing of all the wildfires and the flooding that just happened in Eastern Kentucky. The reason that the flooding is so bad in Eastern Kentucky is because of coal mining and because of like the constant degradation of the environment that leaves no trees to be able to mitigate some of the worst of the flooding. And it means that people are dying. And Eastern Kentucky is a predominantly like white, like lower income community, and they are right in the middle of the sacrifice zone. So I think being able to paying attention to these like we call them like climate disasters. We don't even call them natural disasters anymore. And recognize where like are the communities that are hardest hit by these disasters. Because when we think of like our like the federal government and our lawmakers, who have a lot of wealth and power, they are always going to be able to adapt to the changing conditions, or they're going to die before it gets really bad. And so for them, if they're making profit, it's all good. It doesn't matter. It's not that they don't know that this is happening, it's that they do not care. And I think that is like because it's a really important point to make. So I think being like recognizing there's more wildfires, there's extreme heat waves that are killing people, there are floods that are killing people, and they're killing people because we have failed to pass comprehensive policies that protect frontline communities. And we have still failed to do a lot of that. So.
Wow, well that's daunting, especially after experiencing the heat this week. I'm not good in heat, y'all. It's not gonna work for me. So Naadiya, please share.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in a few things. When I think of the Inflation Reduction Act, I also like to think, and I'm hopeful that some of this permitting language still has a chance to be separated. I've been calling it the API, so the American Petroleum Institute permitting language, because they have highly influenced it. When the draft text was leaked, it literally had their watermark on it. The Petroleum Institute has no reason to be meddling in the future of our environment. since they're part of the reason why we're in this climate catastrophe. And we voted for the people to protect us. And so we should be holding them accountable to not sacrifice our communities any further. So while there is a lot of bad with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's also opportunities, I think, moving forward to continue to hold our elected officials accountable to make sure that these harmful pieces like carbon capture, like some of this other permitting stuff, doesn't disproportionately impact our communities moving forward. I'd also say that this is also one of those moments where one of the most important aspects of the environmental justice movement will be our ability to have solidarity with one another and our ability to have hard conversations. A lot of the big greens came out in such strong support of the Inflation Reduction Act in a way that was really dismissive of the concerns of environmental justice and climate justice organizers and activists, especially knowing that this side deal includes the Mountain Valley Pipeline. It's kind of egregious to think that they were just going to be like, this is the greatest thing ever, with completely like sideswiping EJ and CJ concerns. And so I think the ability for us to sit in this moment, recognize the goods and the bads, and then continue moving forward to kind of fix some of the relationships that have been harmed in the past few weeks, and recognize that we need some of these big greens now more than ever to make sure that they're redistributing resources to the organizations that are going to continue these fights. And then in terms of like what are top issues in my mind, I would say that clean air is one of them. Air pollution is really, really bad in our communities. We're in Baltimore. Baltimore is, I think, was rated asthma capital #3 of the United States, consistently considered one of the asthma capitals. When we have this severe heat, there's also this trapping effect of usually these severe heat days are also coupled with ozone and other particulate matter, to the point where it triggers asthma attacks. It triggers like severe heat wave, or not heat waves, but like heat disease, so like heat stroke. And when you have all that pollution in the air, it kind of adds to that humidity. And so that's why when you're walking around on some of these hot days, it's like you're swimming. Your lungs have that hard time breathing. This is not the same heat that you grew up with, likely. This is not the same heat that your grandparents grew up with. This is a different heat because it's exacerbated by all of the gunk that we have in our air that's directly linked to the incinerator in our communities. Also by kind of like a lot of the transportation or lack of public transportation that we have a lot of highways that directly cut through our communities that are adding diesel particulate matter into the air. So I think as clean air is one of the really big climate issues that Baltimore in particular is very vulnerable to, that a lot of grassroots organizers have been fighting around year after year after year, big wins, then big losses. And so I do want to highlight that as something that I think is really something that we're going to be continuing to fight and that we need more awareness around, because when you have a big win, like when the city council kind of made this decision to try and shut down Bresco, a lot of people hear about it. And then when that goes to litigation and there's like a potential that Bresco is going to stay around, it starts to like die down a little bit. So continuing to like raise the noise that this is an issue that's affecting our community.
Okay, that was a lot, because I always describe walking through this heat as like walking through butter. And my friends laugh at me, but it's like walking through this very, like, it's so thick in the air, like, so you can feel these things. It's just not a fun experience. One of the things is not a question on our kind of list, but what I'm being struck by is the fact that all of you have kind of mentioned the way that people who are not inside this movement discuss things versus how you all are discussing them. And one of the biggest things that I'm seeing, especially like in social media and how a lot of people get their news, is that these things, these topics are becoming political fodder. So of course, like, you know, we know that elections are coming up, and so the EPA stuff is passed. And of course, Democrats are like, see, like, we're about, you know, the earth, we're about this. And so a lot of people, unfortunately, I mean, we're all, I think, learning this, and most of us are trying to, is that we don't really have a good system of like information. So where can people actually get clued in, right, into the actual information where this stuff is being broken down? So when they are hearing it on the news, they're able to say, okay, well, let me go and look at this website or see what this, you know, group who was on the front lines, who was actually doing the work, what do they think about this? Because a lot of us, we can't just depend on our politicians and the kind of news feed that we're a part of to inform us, to have this breakdown. So where should we be going, or who should we be linking up with to get more into this information, to this news? I'm gonna just choose because okay. Nadia, you got it.
Yeah, I'm gonna say a few orgs, but I also wanted to start by saying that like everyone's flawed in many ways, and sometimes organizations have different ways and interpretations of things. So I'm not completely maybe endorsing everything that all these orgs do, but am recognizing that they also uplift a lot of really important stuff. So I'll start with Baltimore organizations. The South Baltimore Community Land Trust. I'd say in terms of like local organizing, they're a really important group. They focus a lot on air quality issues with incineration. Also the Baltimore Compost Collective. They're really tackling a lot of our zero waste issues. In terms of maybe more national organizations, Senowa's mentioned them a few times, but Climate Justice Alliance. I'll do a shameless plug for the organization I work at. We Act for Environmental Justice. I'd also say the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And then this is state level, the University of Maryland, Dr. Sacoby Wilson. Dr. Sacoby Wilson created a Maryland environmental justice mapping tool, which is kind of tracking disparate impacts and pollution in the state of Maryland. So I would definitely uplift a lot of the work that he's doing. I know I missed probably a plethora of groups, so happy for other folks to fill in.
Awesome.
Thanks, Nadia. Yeah, you covered a lot that I'll also pitch the for more national orgs, the National Black Environmental Justice Network, which kind of took a hiatus recently, but is now, you know, back on track, and a really good person to follow. If Nadia, you mentioned him, I'm so sorry I missed it, but Dr. Robert Bullard, who is often known as the father of environmental justice. He does a lot of work, especially around the intersections of environmental justice and health, similar to Dr. Sacoby Wilson. So he has his own website with a lot of his works. He has a ton of books that you can get from the library. And like, if you're just like, I don't know where to begin and want to know like the history of this movement, he is a really great starting point. A lot of very like academic language, I will say, a lot of like citing of studies. So just putting that out there. I will say, also about CJA, if you go on their website, because they are an alliance and there's like 80 plus organizations that work in all different cities and states, they have an excellent list of folks. And I would say, oh my gosh, now I'm like
it's all coming
all of mine are up. All of mine are, I'm gonna have to like think more, but I just want to like name those two. And like I want to plug my org, but I'm like, if you're on the funding side and you're really interested in the disparities of funding in the EJCJ movement, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, not responsible, responsive, is the organization I work for, and we are launching our climate justice work next year. So definitely stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Dante, did you want to share any, or are you good? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think both Nadia and Senowa covered a lot of ground there. I would say for CL, Center for International Environmental Law, we like to focus on different components and release reports in relation to them. So there's a lot of research, deep dives into false solutions like carbon capture and storage to the climate crisis. And so we got a number of reports in that space. We have folks working on people, land, and resources, and making sure people can, especially indigenous groups, can fight back against multinational corporations trying to take over their land and exploit their resources and all that. Yeah, and then we have a human rights component as well. And so there are a number of folks specifically working on human rights issues. There's some work that's also being done on an international plastics treaty, which is very powerful and something that's desperately needed. And then I would also say, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives as well. A lot of good folks there. Yeah, so there's progress being made on a lot of these things, progress being made on the International Plastics Treaty, and we'll see how that ultimately pans out. But there's a great need for something like that, considering the level of plastic in our lives and only about 9% ever being recycled so far. So yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was actually very helpful for me. I see that Dana is putting some of the things that you all mentioned in the chat. So hopefully people are picking those up. I'm going to actually go to our next slide because I think this kind of also feeds into this larger discussion. Obviously, BRJA, we are, we talk a lot about racism and being anti-racist and anti-oppressive. And of course, as you all have mentioned, the EJ movement has a lot of history that is based in exclusion, and that the exclusion of Black and brown people, the exclusion of those in different class systems. And so this is kind of the basic, right, like of how white supremacy shows up in environmentalism, in the discussion, in the fight for environmentalism. How has it kind of continued to fail? What other ways does it show up in this movement and in these discussions?
This is also another very loaded question because there's so much. I think, I talked a little bit about the co-optation of movement terms and the disparities in funding, which are two really big things. You look at a lot of the national big greens, and they are led by white people, right? Mm-hmm. And they might have one staff that works on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's even on their website. So it's fascinating. But I think I went to the University of Vermont. I'm going to give a little anecdote to answer this question, which Vermont is a very white state. I learned about environmentalism, not environmental justice. We learned a lot about how our individual actions are somehow going to stop the climate crisis. I'm here to tell you that is not true overall. It is not to say that individual actions are not important. I am a big composter, gardener, I have community solar, that is not what I am saying. I am saying that, I think a lot of corporations will be like, look, we care about the planet. Here's a graphic on how to recycle better. That's gonna help everything. And instead of being like, if we put a cap on our emissions, if we kept fossil fuels in the ground, if we stop producing toxic chemical laden products, if we had slower shipping times, if there are all of these things that do need to be done on a grand scale, but the scale that a lot of corporations, especially bigger greens, want to talk about are solutions that are like a one size fits all. Like we don't have to change our behavior in order to like mitigate the climate crisis. And what they're really saying is those with wealth and power don't need to change their behavior to mitigate the climate crisis, when Black and brown and frontline communities are going to be sacrificed for the greater good, and the greater good meaning profit. And I think like by mostly white people, I'm not going to say all white, but mostly white folks. And this is so pervasive in movement spaces. It's like say the right things, but like just kind of actually sweep everything under the rug. Environmentalism is a very different, very, very different thing.
Yeah, it's like what I hear you describing is almost the how pervasive like capitalism influences that, right? Where it's like, well, see, if you just buy this like recyclable bag that you can take to the market, you're doing your part because that's what's going to save the earth. But you have to keep buying the bag. You know what I mean? Like you got to replace the bag. If you buy these, this certain water bottle instead of buying plastic, and so it kind of in the real question is at the heart of it is like, maybe we just need to stop producing this and look at other options to do something else. And so where's the money? As they always say, if you ask the question, where's the money going? You usually have a better understanding of how these things continue. So thank you. That's a really, really good. Anybody else, Nadia or Dante, did you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and this is actually just reiterating a point that Senowa made previously, that we have our own solutions. Very often, white organizations are trying to problem solve for people instead of just asking the people what they need. And oftentimes there's also this, I feel like education issue that happens where it's like, oh, you didn't say the right words, so we're going to discredit what you're saying. But if you actually are listening, they already know what's happening. Like we already know that the air is not good. We might not have the language to be like, it's PM 2.5, it's this, and that. Like we might not have these science degrees, but we know that if you can see the air moving from a distance, that there's a problem. If it's 10 degrees warmer in your neighborhood than it is in Roland Park, it's a problem. And you don't need a scientific degree to say that. And oftentimes, and this is really in the context of indigeneity, indigenous organizers, even the way that science is perceived is often white-centric, white Eurocentric. A lot of indigenous organizers have actually had their indigenous practices co-opted. The permaculture movement, that is indigenous history, indigenous ways of being that have been rebranded by white people, and now are being sold at this high price. So I think that there is this constant also colonialization of indigenous knowledge from environmental organizations. Like the whole regenerative agriculture movement, I think, is actually just indigenous ways of having a relationship with the land that now people are trying to rebrand and teach indigenous folks about when they already know. And so I think that there is this constant like greenwashing, colonialization thing that we're battling. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to continue to be kind of vigilant about and hold people accountable for.
You just said a whole like word, because I think this is why when we're talking about these issues and people say, well, we don't need to talk about race. We don't need to bring all this other stuff in it. And it's like, but this is also a part of the work. This is what is actually happening. And it makes it so much harder for the Black and brown people who are closest to the issue, who can say, I may not know, like you said, what this poison is called, but I know when I drink it, I'm being poisoned, right? It's like that they have the solution. Stop poisoning us. how about we look at other, so like, and also we don't want to bring those people in. That happens a lot of the time in a lot of movements. The ones that have the most degrees, the ones that have the most, quote unquote power, they're not always closer to the solution or to the actual issue. They just care about the issue in a different way. And so we need to make sure we have more folks who are closest in the room, speaking, making decisions, and pushing back. So thank you for bringing that up. Dante, did you want to add anything? That was just a lot.
Yeah, just really quickly, like it's been a slow movement toward this, but in doing some of the grant proposal research and writing and whatnot that I did in my old org, like there's a slow trickle towards providing actual funding towards Black led groups. It was much more difficult, I would say, 10 years ago or so, but there are more and more foundations that finally recognize that they do need to support Black led organizations and Indigenous led organizations and what have you. And so it's like it's a small amount of optimism in there, even though there's still a very, very, very white space in providing that funding and to those white led organizations. But and applying to certain things, like you'll see more and more folks saying, "Hey, all right, what is the makeup of your organization? Is it Black led? Is it women led? Because that's also another major component of this too. It's like are women led groups getting the support that they need, and women identifying or queer identifying folks. So yeah, so a little bit of optimism in there, but like there's still a lot more needing to be done with these organizations that have massive amount of money along the way.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What
Okay.
are some of the ways that we can, like, how can we get more involved? Like, I know that we've talked about like maybe some groups we can all look out for. We've talked about, some of the issues we're talking about, that, but how can people get more involved? I also want to ask before we start that, one of the big, when we were planning this event, we were talking about the Justice 40 initiative. And so I really wanted to talk a little bit about that and how that's working. And I'm not sure if people know about it or not. We talked about the definition, but what is I'll call it E40, the Justice 40 initiative, and what are some of like maybe the setbacks for some of those things, as well as zero waste? I mean, that Dante has talked about that in the past.
I feel like Naadiya might be not to tell you on J40, but you've worked more closely, and then I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, so the Justice 40 initiative is an executive order by President Biden, 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And it basically directs that 40% of benefits for climate investments go to disadvantaged communities. And I put things in air quotes because how we define these words is really important. And how the government has gone thus far in defining them has caused a lot of issues. So I'll go in reverse and start with disadvantaged. Right now, the administration has put forth the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, which is a screening tool that shows where disadvantaged communities are. And that screening tool doesn't include race. They were worried about potential litigation, with a good example being some of the issues around Black farmers and money that was supposed to be directed directly towards Black farmers getting caught up in litigation. So they went about not including race in the screening tool, even though race is the top indicator to show whether a community will have a disproportionate burden of pollution. And right now, there's also really no opportunity for communities to self-designate. So if a community has the lived experience of a lot of people having adverse health impacts, their communities going through severe flooding, you're having 100-year flood every 2 years, no opportunity to self-identify as an environmental justice community. And also this weird thing, in my opinion, of people that are in higher education aren't considered disadvantaged. So all of the areas surrounding major universities were automatically kind of disqualified from being considered disadvantaged. But what about your HBCUs and your other minority serving institutions that are also in EJ communities that likely have low income students? All of the students are of color, and they're not considered in a disadvantaged community because they have the privilege to go to college, the privilege to probably put themselves in years of debt, because we're also less likely to have opportunities for funding for college. So that's been a pretty big issue thus far with the Justice 40 initiative. And then I would also say more generally is, do states and localities even know what the Justice 40 initiative is? I'm really hoping in the next few weeks that myself and some other organizations, and hopefully some of the folks on this panel, can work together on trying to have something to brief elected officials on Justice 40 and opportunities for where this money should go in Baltimore City. Because if we're not acting on it fast and uplifting community solutions early on, then there's a really good chance that some of those big greens will step in with whatever solutions they want and take this Justice 40 money, because it benefits community. And what does a benefit mean? Because in my opinion, benefits mean direct dollars. Benefits is not some like vague calculation that is created by some agency and that only agencies have accountability for. So I think that those are some of the big questions around Justice 40 right now. And I also think that we also are in this weird situation where sometimes false solutions, because the government doesn't consider them false solutions, are likely to be considered under the Justice 40 initiative. The Department of Energy recently released their covered programs list. Carbon's on it, carbon capture's on it, nuclear is on it. So all of these things that EJ communities and CJ communities are like, no, don't do this, might be considered a benefit. So who's defining what benefits is? So yeah, that's kind of my high level thoughts on Justice 40. And yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. I think that it's yeah, wow. And zero waste is one of those terms I feel like I've heard a lot of now. Like it's become like I say it in TikToks and on Instagram when I'm on Instagram. But just like it's one of like I want to have zero waste, and it's like usually white women in really unique yoga gear, cleaning and soft music. But what exactly is zero waste, and what does it look like possibly in Baltimore City?
I could go. Yeah, so a couple of things. Just to Naadiya's point on Justice 40, there was a meeting held by Department of Energy and the EPA on Thursday discussing the build out of carbon management, as they call it, false solutions to the climate crisis. And throughout that entire meeting, they only briefly talked about transportation situation for any sort of massive carbon capture build out that this country would need. And most of that's going to be pipelines. And of the pipelines that exist for in the country right now for CO2, one exploded just at the start of the pandemic in 2020 in a Black community outside of Jackson. And it suffocated a number of folks in that area. They had to be evacuated. 46 people were hospitalized. And yet, like, there was no real aggressive effort on behalf of the pipeline company to make sure that these folks were in their emergency plans at all. And so, like, there was so much swept under the rug. They tried to pay people off. And yet these are the types of components, to Naadiya's point, that Justice 40 is being seen as a way to put more of these pipelines, put more carbon capture facilities in communities, and run an enhanced risk of additional suffocation and death. And just, it's wild. I'm going to put a link in the chat about what happened there, because it's definitely worth the read, and it's terrifying and very enraging. But in terms of zero waste, it's a thing that I feel like often, along with climate change for the longest, was very seen as very white oriented, and which is very problematic considering the community in which our incinerator is and is majority Black and has been that way for the last 37 years that facility has been around. And so when we talk about zero waste, we have to talk about the benefits of transitioning to that in terms of economic justice. I mean, at least if we had a 70% diversion rate here in Baltimore, that would be at least 2,000 full-time equivalent jobs that would be created simply because we're not burning and burying stuff. And but that argument's never been made by the city. The city has never had an actual real aggressive recycling and zero waste education. It's never really spent the money on that. It's intentionally sat on the incinerator because it's read the city as too poor, too Black, and has no interest in being a much more sustainable and just city. And the fact that like there are Black leadership in the city perpetuating that cycle, not great. So, you know, I think we need to, when we speak about zero waste to various communities, it has to be attached to the fact that there's economic justice involved in that we don't have to wait for an Amazon or we don't have to wait for a Google or anyone else to come randomly move into the city to provide jobs. And when we actually do commit the city to a zero waste sustainable economy, providing those jobs leads to fewer people needing to be squeegeeing, leads to fewer people needing to find other ways to make money that may put them at risk of being in jail or anything like that. But we've never had a true, like, a progressive climate justice, economic justice, environmental justice oriented policy led by any mayor in the city or anyone in city government. So that needs to change. And I'll just stop there.
Wow, I want to thank you because what you really just described is essentially that Black and brown folks are constantly impacted, you know, in the worst way by these policies, by this, you know, by this kind of emerging issue, continuing issue, and we're also blamed for it. So it's like, oh, well, the reason why we're not kind of getting these things is like, you know, you don't really care about this either. And it's like, yeah, we do. When our kids, you know, have asthma or they're living in a neighborhood where there's no trees and, you know, kids want to play outside and be able to breathe and have fun where there's asphalt everywhere. It's like those things, or people, you know, a lot of people don't think about transportation as not just a civil rights issue, but an environmental issue. I was just telling my dad, you know, this city is built around cars. Like our country is built around cars. And when we travel to other places, I went to Europe, and granted, Europe is not perfect, but one of the things that a lot of people like about it is that it's walkable, right? It's like, so things like that, and they have pretty good transportation systems. Things like that are life-changing. It connects you to people, and it changes how you're able to interact and live. And so that is also a part of this work. I think that you all have described like how those things are connected. I do want to make sure we get in some questions from the audience. Is there anybody who has a question in the audience? You can put it in the chat, or if you want to say it out loud, this is the time for you to do it. And yeah, anybody? The floor is open. Okay. Well, then what we're going to do is, while people are possibly either coming up with questions or just listening, what are some other ways that we can get involved and do more work in our community? Like, what can we do? Like, leaving here, you gave some great information like to read and some, you know, orgs to kind of look into, but what are some things that we can do? How can we push our, you know, people that we're voting for? How do we bring up these issues? What can we do on the ground?
One of the things I'm going to do for sure is get all of my friends who care about this issue, but who have not heard this side of it. Your point, Julia, about the difference in the discourse, you know, out there in the white progressive world, and the conversation here is profound. And I am going to get, I have a very long list of people to communicate with, and I am going to just urge them in the strongest way possible to watch this program, because it's been incredibly informational and powerful. Thank you all so much.
Can I say something right quick?
Sure.
Yes. My name is Cynthia Marshall, and I have been, my kids were 30, 31, and 32. Yeah, 30, 31, and 32. They started from Head Start in PG County. We have been trying to get people to understand about global warming. People's not interested in that. Even my kids, they know about global warming. They, to this day, when they talk to their friends, you put it like this. Howard County, yeah, they've been trying to do global warming back in 19, was it? Well, I started with it in Peachy County. When I moved to Howard County in 2000, they were trying to do a lot of stuff regarding to global warming. However, but what about the DC and PG County were not interested in it. And the more you talk to people about it, they just don't want to talk about it. Now here it is, we're talking about 2022, and my son, he called me, he said, "Ma, is it raining out there?" I said, "It's starting to rain." He said, "Oh, it was raining hard." He was in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. He said, "It's raining hard out here." I said, "Dude, that's global warming." He said, "Oh yeah, you're right." But what I'm saying, should put this, it wasn't a black thing or a white thing. Some people, if our politicians not talking about it, or the news not talking about it, people forget about it. And it's hard now to come in, like I said, this is 2022. What happened in Kentucky? This stuff should have been done back in 1972. But because we elect people who look like us, who talks totally different, well, I'm going to believe them. And I had to tell my mom, I said, "Mom, I got to turn off MSNBC or CNN because they're not talking about it." I said, "Mom, come on. We know that's not good news." But it's, it's really a shame. Even one of my friends who live in Clarksville, she told me it was snowing in the summer.
Yeah. Just really quickly. I mean, I think this comments are really important because we have to meet people where they are, right? I mean, I think you've got a situation where climate change is increasing the number of 100-degree days that we have in Baltimore.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And but for folks in some communities, I mean, people are worried about being able to put food on the table for themselves and their families. And to focus in on a thing that seems relatively abstract is very difficult. But if we're able to, talk about, to Nadia's point earlier, Baltimore being the second worst place to live with asthma, everyone knows someone that deals with asthma in the city, and everyone knows someone that doesn't have air conditioning in their house, has to deal with these increasingly crazy temperatures. But if we were able to have a greater level of connection of that concern about the increasing temperatures with the benefits of installing heat pumps that are much more efficient and would provide a lot of energy and jobs, if we can touch and we can make sure that the economic component is always tied to the environmental component, people are going to resonate with that more because there are so many people that still need living wage work to be able to keep themselves and their families secure. And we don't have that. And so whenever I talk about this stuff, I always want to make sure that we're talking climate change, but we're also talking economic justice, because if you don't talk both of them, it's not going to really hit with a lot of folks. And we've got to be able to make sure that folks know that there's a great benefit on multiple ways for their own health, for their own purses, and whatever. It just makes more sense to always talk about the intersection of economic and environmental justice. So thank you for that comment.
And I also want to bring up just that one of the things that's really kind of come forward for me is that how this is all wrapped up, and just I think as a culture, that we believe that this earth is not like a place that we are sharing, that we just take. There's a culture of take. It's like we want something instantly, we just get it, we buy it if we're able to, we just kind of take. Oh, well, this land over here, we're going to build something, we just kind of use it. And there's no thought process through, oh, well, what about this in a few years? Well, like, how about if we can't depend on this system anymore? So a lot of the issues that, the audience member just was speaking about is also just like, I mean, you're right. If I can't feed my family, why am I worried about the air at this moment? That's not a tangible thing. I know I need to eat. If I can't get a job, like, I'm not worried about, the earth, like the second, I just know that I can't survive in it. And so that this is actually all a part, we're all having the same conversation, but that it's actually like divvied up in these different things. We have to worry about the food on the table. We gotta have stores to get the food. And we gotta have farms that are gonna grow the food. It's like so all of these things are connected in our relationship to our community, to our earth, to our world, is a part of kind of changing how it operates, but those things have to be connected first. I really think that, and this is also why I asked that question, like, where do we get the information? Because you're right, MSNBC is not going to talk about it. It's like, that's not the news that is making the money of the day. It's like what's making the money is, oh, Trump and, Mueller and whomever else of the day. And that it's important to kind of see through those things. That part of this work is also making sure that we have a better understanding and access to information, and that we're questioning. I feel like a lot of people, we don't like to question sometimes. It's hard. It's hard to do because a lot of these things are, they're not clean cut. They're not black and white. I want to, before because we are, coming up on the last couple of minutes, I want to make sure if there's anything else you all want to share or push to our audience today. Obviously, we could talk about this topic probably for the whole day and still not be finished. So I want to make sure that you are able to share any kind of initiatives or programs or social media you want to share, or things that people should look at, or events before we go. Here's your plugging moment. And I'm hoping based on what we discussed today, we can have another kind of follow-up event where we kind of broaden this discussion with you all and some other folks. So here's your moment, and then we're going to start to close out.
I personally don't have like social media that is very public, but I do want to say on the kind of like get involved thing, like something that I have found really helpful is like climate change is not meant to be like an individual issue to solve, right? This is a systemic issue. This is a global issue. Climate has no borders. And that's like really daunting, right? Like when I think of the climate crisis and all the things that need to happen, I'm like, I am overwhelmed, and I do this work every day. And something that when the pandemic hit that I started doing is like getting involved in neighborhood mutual aid work, or just like even community like organizations that are like on your block or your surrounding blocks. There are community gardens all around Baltimore that constantly need volunteers and are, doing excellent work on like learning how to grow your own food, right? Like these are very small local initiative, like neighborhood initiatives, but like if everyone is doing those in their communities, like it's going to make a big impact. And like mutual aid is very much connected to environmental justice, right? Like it might not use the same language, and that is fully okay, but it is about like getting involved in like your very specific community and doing like some small things with people is incredibly important, as like volunteering at national orgs or going to protests, which are also important. So I just want to say that.
Thank you so much. Naadiya, then Dante.
Yeah, I guess I mainly wanted to just plug some other organizations that I forgot to mention previously: the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, EJHA, Michelle Roberts. I don't know if she'll be watching this at any point, but she personally has been really transformative in my understanding of environmental justice. Black Yield Institute, focusing on food sovereignty and food apartheid in Baltimore City. And then also another shameless plug for Black millennials for Flint, focusing on lead remediation and lead pipes and lead paint in Baltimore City. I really kind of, Senowa said everything that I feel like I also wanted to say, that this can be really overwhelming at times. So community support, community networks, and even more so with like heat waves and stuff, just checking on your neighbors, making sure that folks are doing okay. And also like sometimes saying like, hey, like maybe let's not do that outdoor thing today because it's 105 degrees and it might not be good for you. So yeah, I think community care is critical, and will be ever more so as we move forward.
Thank you so much. And Dante.
Yeah, I think both Senowa and Nadia covered a lot of good options, and I think someone lifted up Black Yield Institute in the chat as well. I just realized that in terms of a national org, I would encourage folks to check out, it would be Taproot Earth, which formerly was the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and they just switched their brand over. But they've been holding, or starting to hold, different webinars about what's going on in the Gulf South, and there are very significant pockets of people of color all along the Gulf Coast, from Texas to Florida and in Puerto Rico as well, and there's a lot of interest in building out additional infrastructure that's going to worsen the climate crisis here and everywhere. So checking out their webinars this month on Tuesdays, I think. It's either Tuesdays or Wednesdays, but they're a really good organization. And what else I was going to say? Yeah, I mean, I think there's also ways to, there is money out there nowadays to start businesses around fighting climate change, or even if it's a small thing such as installing those heat pumps or changing the colors of roofs and whatnot, to minimize the impact of those temperatures. There are different foundations looking for those types of projects, and so in the event that those are things that interest you, you certainly can identify some of those folks, and I'd be happy to work with folks to see if we can find some potential funding for those things as well. Because like someone mentioned, like it all ties to violence as well in the city, and the more hot this city gets, the more of a struggle that's going to be, and the more we choose not to invest in fighting the root causes, the worse it's going to be. And so the police aren't going to save anything. Police aren't going to solve anything. We need actual grassroots groundwork businesses to lift up these communities like Sandtown, like Cherry Hill. That's the only way we're going to get anywhere. And we've got to keep pushing back against these additional false solutions on the front lines here.
I want to thank you all, Senowa, Nadia, Dante, for a really intense, but really, I think, hopefully fruitful conversation. I have learned a lot just speaking with you all and you sharing resources in the last couple of weeks. It has been like really helpful, and I have like a new kind of like rejuvenation, kind of reading and learning, and hopefully working with you all again in the future. I also want to take the time to thank Michelle and Kate and Dana and kind of helping us get this event together. We are not able to talk about every single thing, but I think that part of it is, you know, just like I say, so this is not a one-person solution. We're all working together, and it's going to take us to all kind of shift and change and continue to learn. So hopefully we can continue to do events like these to educate and bring folks who are doing the work to the people, so we can actually, you know, help the best way that we can. And I want to thank all of you all in the audience. It's a beautiful Saturday, so I know that people could be out doing anything, but choosing to, you know, be with us. Thank you so much. And I hope you all learned something new and took something from this. And I hope that we can expand this conversation later on. Thank you so much for joining BRJA, and we will see you next month for Underreported News Part 2. Thanks to our panel, and thanks to everybody else for joining us. Have a good Saturday.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you,
Thank
Dana.
you,
Thank
Julia.
all you folks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody.